Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's CBI coronavirus webinar. It's quite a day. We are a few hours away from hearing Chancellor Rishi Sunak's plans for jobs and the recovery of the economy. And given that we've held these seminars primarily to try and think about how businesses across the UK are going to get through this, today is a particularly important day, and we're particularly lucky to have a chance to, I hope, not gaze into our crystal ball, but try and give some context for the statement that's to come. Rain Newton-Smith is the CBI's chief economist. I'm hoping we'll hear from Rain a good deal about the macro picture and the outlook for the economy. Isabel Maddock is the CFO of James Cropper, the specialist paper business, and I hope we'll hear a fair bit about the choices that businesses face and what businesses need, not just in the next few weeks, but in the next 6 to 12 months. And of course, everyone on the call will know David Gauke was Chief Secretary to the Treasury and Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, amongst a number of other things, is now at Macfarlane's. And David, we're really grateful to have you here, because one of the things that's hardest to understand in this is what's really available to government, what governments can do. So I hope in the course of the conversation we'll learn that. These webinars have really worked because it's not just, garnering intelligence from people like Rain and Isabel and David, but from everyone on the call. So where possible, please do point out what you think is needed, things that you think the Chancellor should or might be addressing. Do just raise it in the chat. As ever, if you want to do so anonymously, just write a non at the beginning of it. But Rain, can we start with you? I'm one of those people who's confused. At the end of last week, I think it was, Andy Haldane at the Bank of England gave quite an optimistic outlook for the economy. All the while, you're hearing really quite extraordinary talk about the scale of job losses that look set to come in 2020. Can you give us a framework for thinking about the outlook for the economy, and whether or not you think that the Andy Haldane optimism is well founded?
Well, look, I think one of the areas where I do agree with Andy is that if we look at what will happen in Q2, in this very last most recent quarter, it's likely that the fall in output is going to be, on one level catastrophic. I mean, bigger than anything we've ever sort of seen before, but it maybe isn't quite as bad as some of the scenarios that were set out at the beginning. And I think some of the reasons behind that is because actually we started to open up our economy a bit sooner than I think people had originally expected back when the Bank of England did their first sort of forecast after the virus had really hit the UK economy. But I think what we all agree on is actually the severity of what we've seen is really unprecedented. I mean, if we look at the size of the UK economy at the end of April, it's 25% smaller than it was at the end of February. I mean, that is unbelievable. And of course, within that, I mean, and Ruby McGregor-Smith was talking about this in the airline industry. You've seen air travel is down over 90%. Same for car sales. I mean, these are just figures that don't fit on charts anymore. And so, I think but I guess if there is a ray of light, what we do know is the worst is behind us. We are starting to open up our economy. Many businesses have obviously continued to operate throughout, but we are seeing, positive signs that even demand is picking up. And I think what we're seeing actually is manufacturing is more resilient than the services sector, and that is a theme we saw in Asia. So we can see that the overall manufacturing output is starting to pick up. But I think the biggest concern that businesses have at the moment when they're looking at their operational challenges is about demand. So over 3/4 of businesses are just worried that overall demand in the economy at the moment will just be too weak. And I think there are some rays of light on that, and that is something that Andy Haldane was looking at. He looked at some of the high frequency data about restaurant searches, and we can see some of that momentum has picked up. And when you look at retail sales volumes, as a whole, over the course of May, they grew by about 12%. So people have been spending more in May than they did in April. But, and this is a huge but, we know that overall demand is still a lot weaker than it was in February. And if you talk to retailers, you know, a lot of the non-essential retailers will say, yes, they've opened their doors, but the overall demand they're seeing is at least 40% what it would be at this time of year. So it's still really, really tough out there. And of course, and this is something Andy Haldane talked about later in his speech, but it got less attention, is what really matters is where we end up on unemployment, right? That is where you see the real scarring effects from recessions. And I think that's where, you know, we know that the Chancellor is going to make some important announcements about new schemes to help young people into jobs. And that's where we need to see, you know, when we come to the virus, our focus was about flattening the curve of the virus, and we need to see the same approach with unemployment. Our absolute aim has got to be to make sure that we flatten that curve of unemployment and try to minimize the impact on job losses. And that's about absolutely helping businesses to survive. And I think, again, that's an area we'd like to see the Chancellor take more action. But that's how you make sure you don't see scarring effects. You've got to keep businesses going, creating jobs. You've got to keep opportunities out there for young people in particular, and those who have been out of the job market for more than 6 months. That's when you start to see lasting damages on households, on people's job prospects over the long term.
Rain, thank you. Let's come back to the demand stimulus, because obviously there's going to be some discussion of that. But actually, David, given what Rain was just saying about unemployment, you know, it's funny, I think increasingly I feel generally too old. And when it comes to thinking about mass unemployment, I worry that I'm not old enough, that in our adult lives, none of us have had experience of how you deal with this. And it's really hard to understand what tools, what levers are really at the government's disposal to try and address the prospect of mass unemployment. Will you talk us through, both from a Treasury perspective, but also work and pensions, how they would see this problem?
Well, I think you're right that jobs are the key, and I think that's going to be the focus for the Chancellor today. So I think pretty well everything that he will be doing will be focused on, I think Rain puts it well, flattening the curve. You've got sort of specific things that you can do to try to help. So we've already heard about this job scheme for younger people. I thought it was a sensible announcement to increase the number of work coaches in job centres. They do a really good job, in my view. As you say, I was the Work and Pension Secretary for a while, and I think they're really helpful in terms of getting into work and guiding people in the direction. So proactively helping individuals. Yeah, I think you can help particular sectors that are hit hard by the lockdown and by the effects of the virus. So we'll see what sort of sectoral measures he'll announce. There are things that you can do in terms of stimulating particular activity. So home insulation, that's quite labor intensive. We're going to need to do this anyway. So we've got an announcement on that. And then there's a sort of broader question, which is, do you want to stimulate demand? How do you do that? Do you cut VAT? I'm a little skeptical as to whether that's necessarily the right stage at this point. I think I prefer more targeted measures, which is largely what they've announced. And I also, my personal view is we haven't heard very much yet about whether they'll do anything with employers' national insurance contributions. That strikes me as a sensible response if we're trying to keep people in employment. So there's a lot of what could be described as sort of micro measures. And then there's the question of the sort of macro measures of, about stimulating demand. I think one of the reasons I'm a little hesitant about it, and I suspect there'll be voices in the Treasury similarly inclined, is that I think what's holding back demand at the moment is concern about the virus. It's about health. That's, people don't necessarily want to go out to pubs because they're worried they might pick up the virus. They might not be worried about their own health, that they might spread it to somebody else. And I think that's probably still the biggest suppressor of demand, rather than money in people's pocket. Now that might change, and there might be a time where you want to boost demand by cutting VAT across the board, but I don't think we're quite there yet. So if that's why they don't cut VAT, I suspect that'll be the reason.
And can you just spell out the NICs idea? What would you suggest would be effective?
Well, I think, you know, NICs, employers' NICs, it is a jobs tax. It is a tax on employment, and if you want more employment, you ought to lower the tax on it. And you could do that a number of ways. You could lower the rates of employers' NICs. You could raise the threshold on the NICs charge on individuals, or you could increase the employment allowance, which is particularly helpful for smaller businesses, so that an employer doesn't, you know, at the moment doesn't have to pay what would be the first £4,000 worth of NICs. You could increase that quite substantially. That would help smaller businesses. So those are policy options available to the Chancellor. We haven't heard anything about that in all the things that have been pre-briefed. I can only assume that there is at least one big announcement that is saved for the day. That was always the way we did it in my day, and I hope it'll be something on employers' NICs. I think that's where I would go.
Isabel, can I ask you just to pick up on that? What do you think, not just for James Cropper, but for businesses generally, they'd like to see today in terms of assistance, particularly around jobs and support of people in employment?
Yeah, so I think NICs can be very, very helpful. I think some of the work on the apprenticeship levy and what we're seeing in the papers in terms of supporting employment will certainly help a number of industries. It won't necessarily help us in manufacturing, but I think it will help to increase confidence, to retain people, to recruit people, and to help position companies, because companies are having to reframe how they operate as COVID-19 is still with us, and then where they need to be when we come out of the curve. And that's really important, and being able to do that planning and to work towards those goals of operating in an environment that is COVID secure and safe, and without cash leaking out of the business, and then being able to position yourself for growth at a point when you're ready to really grow and seize opportunities is really important. And bringing people in and retaining your key people and having the skills in place and doing the training that's necessary in order to seize opportunities and to evolve is really important.
Okay, and as well, can I just ask you, what one person, as you were talking, raised this interesting question about support for the young and targeted support for the young, and this issue of, as it's been flagged, a 16 to 24 age gap in terms of that support, and the problems with the 24 age ceiling, i.e. that there are going to be people who are older than 24 who are going to miss out on that support. How do you, when you think about young people in the business, do you think 16 to 24 is a sensible range? Do you think it should run high? It's a difficult one, but it is going to be meaningful for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure if there's a right answer. I don't personally. I think of young people as being probably 16 to 35. I think there's a breadth of skills out there, and they have so much to bring to the business, and each one of those generations are bringing new things, and in order to grow in the future, we really need to be embracing workforce at every tier and every generational tier, because demand is for everybody out there, whatever form it takes. It's not just about the new generation.
Yeah, I suspect that this is going to become a very live conversation point almost as soon as the Chancellor sits down. Rain, and actually David, I wanted to talk a little bit more, as I said, about demand. Back in March and early April, we all became instant epidemiologists, and now, Rain, I should say, we're coming for you. We're now all going to become instant economists and specialists in demand stimulus. Would you just talk us through a little how you see VAT cuts in particular, but then these discussions that there has been about certain kinds of vouchers? David mentioned on support for home insulation, but there's been talk of, in effect, helicopter money for particular sectors, and what you think of that, and whether that's economically ever proven to be effective.
Well, look, I think if ever there's a time to try out new ideas, it's now, because the scale of the crisis we've been seeing is just unprecedented. I think when it comes to, what a generalized VAT cut was something that we did after the last global financial crisis, and it was generally seen to be effective, but it was temporary. And I think there's a couple of things that are different now that mean it may not be the best tool or the best lever for us to try right now. Though I do think that targeted VAT cuts, particularly for the hard hit sectors in hospitality and, in restaurants, making it, cheaper for when people do go out and spend in a restaurant, they're able to spend a bit more. Because if you're operating a restaurant, one of the things they say is it's, you're having to operate at such lower capacity it's going to be much harder to make a profit. So that I can really see targeted VAT being helpful. I think the problem with the generalized issue is that actually inflation is really low, and one of the things a VAT cut would do would be to push inflation even lower, and it tends to only have a temporary impact on demand. And I think one of the other issues that we face at the moment is, in some sectors, it's getting capacity up to what we need is the real challenge. So it could actually unintentionally, where it is harder to to get goods and services to the people who need, because we're operating under social distancing, it could exacerbate some challenges in some sectors. So I think, to our mind, it's about targeted VAT cuts. And actually the other bit where we think we need to see more action is on supporting businesses themselves. And it comes back to what Isabel was talking about. When we look across our surveys of business, 7 out of 10 businesses are still facing real challenges around their cash flow. And that's despite all the loan schemes we've seen. So and as Isabel was saying, a lot of businesses are just facing really high fixed costs at the moment. It's actually more expensive to open up when you need to, make sure you have extra people, that you have all the safety measures in place. And so one way you could really address that is to provide a business rates holiday for all sectors, not just retail and hospitality. Our manufacturers are really challenged by some of these higher fixed costs, and business rates is something you pay before you've even made a profit. And that's one targeted way you could provide support to businesses to survive. And that helps to, it helps on the supply, but it also helps on the demand through the whole supply chain. So that's one area we really think we should see more action. And the other area is around providing more grants, extending that system. It's been really successful at supporting our high street shops. But in a targeted way, you could provide more money to local authorities to help local businesses in the area that fall just outside the sectors where help has already been provided. So I think we see that as really, really important, and something that the Chancellor, we absolutely hope, will take some action on today.
David, can I ask you just to follow up on that? So start with just on the demand side, the support, VAT and other measures of support. What do you think are the pros and cons of the different measures? I appreciate what you said about Treasury's concern about VAT, but what can government do to actually increase demand?
Well, I think VAT is something that you can use. It was used by the government in 2008. And the advantage of VAT is that you can do it quickly, practically overnight. And there are two aspects to it. One, it makes some things cheaper. And that's why it might, if you do it on a sectoral basis, and you get more spending in those areas. The other point is that it just leaves more money in people's pocket at the end of the month. They've got more because they haven't spent it on VAT, and they might go out and spend it again. But I completely understand Rain's point that in some cases the restriction is about supply, that it's just businesses can't accommodate additional demand. And I come back to the point I was making earlier. What is the thing that is driving down consumer demand, perhaps more than anything else? It is about a lack of confidence that is part economic, but it is also to a large extent about the health side. So, you know, I think the government is right to take the measures it's trying to take. But, you know, fundamentally, the speed at which we recover, we get out of this, is going to be driven by progress against COVID-19 and, you know, progress on treatment and vaccination and progress in driving down infection rates. So there's a limit, I think, to what government can do to boost demand in the current circumstances. But as I say, that might change. You know, we might, if we've made progress on the disease, and then it's just a question of consumers still a bit nervous about spending money, they might be worried about losing their jobs. That's the point where you can make a bigger contribution. And then you've also got, but coming back to the earlier point, there's a sectoral point, and there are some sectors that are hit much harder. And what do you do to support them? And there will be a little bit of nervousness in the Treasury, and this may come across as sort of slightly controversial, but everything the government has done up until now has been, if you like, trying to freeze the jobs that were in existence at the beginning of this crisis. And what we know is that the jobs at the beginning of this crisis were based on consumer preferences in February, March this year. And at the point we come out of this health crisis, consumer preferences are going to be a bit different. And the distribution of jobs is going to have to be a bit different. And the challenge for policymakers is providing the necessary support in the months ahead for those sectors that have been badly hit, but also ensuring that our employment market isn't so rigid that we come out of this and people are doing the wrong things. And those businesses, for example, that are in a position to expand, that want new labour, have kind of got access to people, and you're not forcing people through incentives to do jobs that don't in reality exist. And that's an incredibly difficult task. And at one level, the task of the Chancellor today is quite straightforward. It's about supporting jobs. But underlying that, there's got to be some thought as to how do you support vulnerable sectors who are, if you like, unfairly hit by the restrictions, but also ensure that we have got a dynamic labour market that enables resources to go where they're really needed. And that's the toughest task, I think, ahead of the Chancellor today.
And David, it seems to me as though you put your finger on precisely the policy choice that so far the government has alluded to but not made. As in, does the Treasury, does number 11 say, we actually think that this is a moment where we need to allow the laws of the market to work, because this is a long-term redirection of the economy. We've had a long-term effort to improve productivity. We shouldn't be supporting jobs that are uneconomic. Or should we be saying that, yes, productivity is an issue. Yes, we do need to make sure that the economy is dynamic, but for the time being, 2020, 2021, keeping people in employment is more important in order to sustain demand and confidence. And it seems to me you can't have both things. You have to choose one or the other. Isn't that right?
Yes, I mean, to some extent, they'll try to have their cake and eat it for as long as possible, and understandably so. And there is absolutely, you set it out well, James, there's a tension between those two objectives. I think the government will probably err on the side of maintaining jobs rather than letting the market discipline come into effect. And I think they'd be right to do so for the moment. But the time is approaching where we will have to sort of settle down into the new situation. So I suspect there will be quite a bit of sectoral support. I think that's justified at the moment. But even now, the government will have to bear in mind that there are changes in the market. I mean, we're seeing this. Aviation is the obvious example. Where companies are sadly laying people off. But from an economic point of view, if there aren't jobs for those people at the end of this crisis, and there won't be jobs for everybody in the aviation sector, then it makes sense to release those people sooner rather than later, get on, build a new career, seize new opportunities, difficult though it is for each individual who's caught up with that. But that's unfortunately what a dynamic, productive economy requires.
Rain, can I just ask you, what do you think on this? Because it seems to me that the rubber hits the road, particularly around the furlough scheme. As in, do you create an extended furlough scheme for specific sectors? What do you think on that?
So I think what we need to use the time is to almost create new schemes. That the job retention scheme we know has been a huge lifeline for businesses. 8 in 10 businesses have been using the scheme. It's supported over 9 million jobs, and it really has played a huge role in flattening that curve of unemployment. But we can't keep that scheme going forever. It's right to taper it. Now, it could be that later in the autumn you want to think about some kind of targeted version of continuing that scheme. But to be honest, I think where we need to focus the efforts is around a scheme for young people. And the other idea we think is certainly worth considering is whether you can have a smaller subsidy in some of these large employment sectors where the sector's still being impacted by social distancing. So could you have a system where you're paying 10% of wages just to make it to lower some of the costs for businesses in keeping people on. So it's not as generous by any means as the job retention scheme. And importantly, instead of subsidizing people to stay at home, you're subsidizing the job creation and retaining those critical roles, particularly in hospitality, in the leisure sector, in the arts, in sectors where it's just been so, they're still really hit by the social distancing measures. But
Sorry,
I think
Rain, is the suggestion that it's 10% that the employer pays 90% government, or 90% that the employer pays 10% government?
So the employer pays 90% of the wages and it's for people on the lower end. So in the who are being, so within those sectors, the employer is paying 90% of the wages, but the government is topping by 10%. So it's a bit, in a way, what it's doing, right, is if you were generally how labor markets would work is all that flexibility would happen through wages, right? So wages would go, but importantly, we have the national minimum wage, which is there to protect people's wages, to keep, a certain minimum wage. But what you're effectively doing is the government is allowing a little bit more flexibility in that wage for the employer, but still protecting the overall amount that the employee gets. Yeah. And we think in this unusual situation, just having that marginal subsidy can just help at the margin ensure that more and more jobs are protected. And we think that's really, really valuable.
Right. I'm just going to read you, Ray, just one thing, just because it's a really good example, I think, of the feeling and the concern about how support comes in. Given it's widely accepted that young people will be disproportionately affected by the restrictions on hospitality and the reduced demand in retail, is there not an overwhelming case for expenditure furlough for those sectors? Isn't keeping young people in jobs better than schemes that might not present alternatives? I think the targeted argument you hear really strongly, and there are a few points that have been made along those lines this morning.
Yeah, so I think that's really important. There's two parts to that, right? One is how do you target young people? And I think the scheme that's being announced today, this Kickstarter scheme, will be really important. And in a way, what that is suggesting is that the government for 6 months will be paying they'll be covering 100% of national minimum wage for 25 hours for young people. So essentially, the government is paying for 6 months, a young person's wages for 6 months. And so if you think about it, that's going to create a huge incentive for employers where they are looking to create jobs to take on young people. And there's a similar scheme that actually operates at the moment in Wales, and it's been very successful. And after the last global financial crisis, we had the Jobs Futures Fund, and it was seen as helping to create over 100,000, get 100,000 young people into employment. And the scale of what we need this time is much bigger. So that could be, and we know that it's young people, particularly in retail, hospitality, and leisure. They're often they're more likely to be employed in those sectors. So you're making it easier for people to create jobs for those young people. Because the other thing we are finding talking to businesses is they absolutely want to take on young people, but you've got to understand they have less experience of the workplace. And it's much harder to do training at the moment, right? Businesses are quite concerned about taking on young graduates because they say, look, we can't give them the support we normally would. We can't have them integrated with our teams and meeting people face to face and understanding how our factory operates and learning on the job in the same way, because so many people are working remotely. So figuring out how training works for young people at the moment is a lot harder to do. So again, having that way of subsidizing their wages for a period of time just makes it easier for businesses to create those roles. And I think that targeted scheme at young people is really what we need, because they carry the scars for longer throughout their working lives. That's what we've learned from previous recessions.
Isabel, could you just follow up on that, particularly about how businesses see taking on young people and the training point that Rain was making, but also someone was asking, while she was talking about regional support and whether or not, as well as thinking sectorally, the government needs to or has any benefit in thinking regionally.
So I think it's really tough at the moment just having this isolated working from home environment for a lot of companies. So onboarding anyone, no matter what age, into a new job or into an apprenticeship scheme or graduate is really, really difficult. And for companies to really thrive, they need to have that sort of conducive environment which is open to engagement and creative thinking, and you need to be able to have interactions and rub off on each other. And that just is the essence of how to work well and how to tackle the problems that companies have, and to deal with opportunities of demand and growth and productivity. And so it's going to be really, really difficult if this continues to onboard people in that environment. Now, certainly in manufacturing, where companies have been able to remain open, then actually that is easier to take on apprenticeships. And we certainly do. We have a number of apprenticeships, and we will just continue the programme in the best way we possibly can in our COVID secure environment. And it's actually quite fun. You know, you can still have corridor conversations, and you can meet people from across a room at 2 meters apart, or you can go outside and use the outside to just bounce ideas of each other. So that's really useful. Sorry, what was the other question, James? Can you?
It's about regional, one person asked about regional support, and it's clear that you're seeing the impacts on unemployment vary significantly, even already by region, and yet so far that's not been the approach that's been taken. But with the possibility of local lockdowns, micro lockdowns, I think there's just a whole raft of questions now that are beginning to arise about regional interventions.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, because no matter what choices you make, it's always going to be difficult for other sectors and other regions. Certainly in terms of our business, it is more sector driven.
Right.
You know, we have suffered from the aerospace industry being down because a number of our high performance fails and substrates go into making aircraft, but the opportunities that we can gain are where we see there's still clear trends in the future. So even beyond COVID-19, we can work with the fuel cell industry and the wind industry and the fire protection industry, and we can grow towards that. So the support that government can give is more about support in being able to invest in capital intensive industry to bring capability on board as well as capacity, so that you can win contracts. Yeah. And it's also support for training. It's absolutely critical that we have support for training, and that is both through apprenticeships, which is a brilliant scheme in itself, but you have to remember apprenticeships are very much a long game. You bring someone in, and the benefit is 3 to 5 years down the line, and it's fantastic for them. It's great for their recruitment. It's great for the people in the teams they work with, because they benefit too, and the employer benefits eventually, and it's fantastic for career progression. But companies need to be able to spend money on training here and today and the apprenticeship levy in itself doesn't lend itself to that, and it could be very, very useful to have that broadened, because in the short term, we really need to be able to evolve to remain current. And sometimes that evolve means actually we need to touch the breadth of the workforce very, very quickly. You need programs that sort of deal with diversity training, safety training. Safety training is so important. We're talking about shifting cultural aspects of the way people behave in the workplace so that they really embrace safety personally and for them and their teams and are committed to it, as opposed to just doing it by compliance. And cultural training in terms of leadership and management styles, and just bringing psychological safety in the workplace, so that it's really important to be able to have safe conversations and not to feel like any idea is stupid, so that you can kick things about and work out how to get to where you need to get to. So if governments can provide support and investment in people and training here and now for us all to make the changes we need to be ready to come out of this, that would be very, very useful.
Yeah, no, the training point is clearly a massive, practical point to accompany what's being supported or proposed in terms of jobs. David, can I come back to you on one other sort of strand of questions that's come up this morning, which is about property, and in two regards. One is about rents and how the government can or should intervene in terms of rents to sustain businesses, and the other one is that world of unintended consequences, stamp duty, and what's the best way to approach stamp duty, and what you think of what's so far been aired about the idea of raising the threshold to £500,000. Will you tell us what you think on both of those?
Okay, well, I think in terms of rent is a really difficult one, because it's a big cost for businesses, but also you've got another side. If they're not paying rent, somebody else is going to suffer from that. In the end, whether that's pension funds or whatever. But I mean, that's quite a difficult one, and in the end, you've kind of got to let the market work, and there's a question of timing on that. Stamp duty, I have to say, I think it was really unfortunate that there was a briefed earlier in the week that they were going to cut stamp duty, but only in November. I mean, I was part of a Treasury team that made changes to stamp duty in the past. You have to do it really quickly, from announcement to implementation. You really want to do it on the same day. And it's clear now that they are going to do something, and it's going to take effect immediately. It will help move the housing market along. There will be knock-on jobs, builders, decorators, etc., etc. As a consequence of that, it probably wouldn't be my priority, because I think I would focus on employers' national insurance contributions, but there will be some benefit for it. But I think there's an interesting point as to whether this is a signal towards a long-term reform of stamp duty. And there I have a worry, which is I'm not sure we can afford anything that is going to mean we tax property less. I mean, there could be a bold reform here. There are better ways probably of taxing property, but in the end, we're going to need the money. So I'd be fascinated to hear what the Chancellor has to say on this. Is it a one-off, short-term boost, get the housing market moving, bring a few transactions forward? Won't do much harm, probably do a bit of good, will help a few people in terms of jobs, but it wouldn't be top of my list.
So, and before I go back to Ray, can I just pick up on that? I suppose finally, David, the politics of all of this. I saw the Conservative MP Edward Lee saying yesterday that he would like the government to stop invoking progressive presidents like Franklin Roosevelt and start invoking presidents like Ronald Reagan, i.e. worrying about the extent to which the government is spending and borrowing, and not particularly excited by talk of a New Deal. Can you just tell us a little bit about how much the politics of that within the Conservative Party will play, between those who say, okay, let's just get the spending taps open and go for it, and those people who say, we're Conservatives, we're about fiscal prudence, let's be careful? How will that play out in the Treasury's thinking?
I think there's a short term and there's a medium term side to this. I think most of the Conservative Party, and I should say I'm no longer a member of the Conservative Party, but most of the Conservative Party is of the view that in the short term, the government needs to support the economy, that we need to minimise scarring, that we need to be active and doing lots of things. And I very much agree with that. I think there is then an issue as we come out of the crisis, and this is something that probably not going to be addressed today, but will need to be addressed in the autumn, is what's the long-term plan? One, in terms of the level of borrowing, how comfortable are we with large deficits? What are we going to do to reduce it? And then the second point, which is, how do we reduce it? Is this about further cuts in spending? Is this about increases in taxes? If it's about increases in taxes, which taxes? And I think there, on those longer term issues, there probably is quite a debate going on within the Conservative Party. There's part of it is about the economic circumstances we're in. Part of it is about the nature of the coalition of support that the Conservative Party gained at the last general election. There have been a couple of studies done the last 3 weeks showing that the swing voters in the swing constituencies in the Red Wall are economically quite left-wing. They're not particularly in favour of sort of low taxes. They are suspicious that the rules are rigged in favour of the rich. They tend to be quite hostile to the market, and I think over time that tension, both in terms of the size of the state, in terms of the view of the market, and fiscal conservatism, how worried are we about large deficits? Those tensions I think will be quite considerable, but they're not there yet, and they're not there in the short term. And I think a bold set of measures today will have a lot of support on the Conservative benches. So I don't think it's a short-term problem for Rishi Sunak or the government as a whole, but I think it's going to be fascinating over the next 6 to 18 months or so as we sort of sort out our longer-term thinking.
Okay, David, thank you so much. Rain, I want to just come back to you at the end, if I might, and forgive me for being quite so frank. I think that if you look at the first phase of the government's response to the coronavirus, often it was finding itself playing catch up with its own rhetoric. It was announcing things and then finding, often in consultation, frankly, with the CBI, to say, actually, this is not enough, we're going to need to move and do more. Tell us a little bit about how you think after the Chancellor sits down, because we're into July and August, we probably don't get anything again until a budget in the autumn. How are you going to monitor whether the support's working and whether there can be an iterative approach to that support, both on the demand and the supply side?
So look, I guess the way I see it, I think where we probably take a little bit of a different view to where I think the Treasury are at the moment is just on this. We think there needs to be more action now to help businesses through the next 3 to 6 months. I think we, maybe because we're talking to businesses on a daily basis and we see the challenges we're facing, we think prevention is better than cure, and that we should be being a bit more bolder on some of those supply side measures to support businesses through this crisis. And I think, but look, where we are working very closely with the Treasury is about the support to the labour market. How do we make that Kickstarter scheme for young people work, as well? How do we get it out at speed and at scale and make it work really effectively? That's where we're really talking to the Treasury. And if we're thinking about other measures to support job creation, how do we make those work effectively? I think that's where business and government need to work hand in glove, because for these measures to work well on the ground, as we've seen with the job retention scheme, you've got to be talking to businesses to design the guidance so they work in a very practical way. And that's what we'll be doing as soon as the Chancellor sits down, is how can we make these things work really, really effectively on the ground.
Okay, Rain, thank you. And thanks for the nod to scale, because I think everyone is trying to figure out exactly that point. A big thank you this morning to you, Isabel Maddock, and to David Gork, and as ever, Ray Newton-Smith from CBI. As you'll know, on Fridays, we've been running a series looking at race inequality in the workplace. This Friday, we're going to be talking about inclusive recruitment and progression. Paul Cisse, the founder and chief executive of Black Leaders Network, and Aggie Mutuma, the company director from the Mahogany Inclusion Partners, will be there, and so will Josh Hardy, the deputy director general of the CBI. Please do join us, and with that, I hope you have an interesting day. I'm no doubt it will be, and a very good one. Thanks for joining us.